Ben Carter wiped sweat from his brow as he tightened the last bolt on the plaza's malfunctioning fountain. Another invisible day in an invisible life. At 34, he'd mastered the art of blending into backgrounds. Just a maintenance worker, in faded coveralls, earning enough to keep his 8-year-old son fed and housed. The wealthy shoppers barely noticed him as they strolled past with their designer bags and carefree laughter. That's exactly how Ben preferred it. No complications, no expectations beyond fixing what was broken. But today would be different. Today, a split-second decision would change everything, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. Because sometimes the most ordinary heroes make the most extraordinary choices, without ever knowing they're being watched by someone who understands the true value of a good heart. What happens when a billionaire discovers that the man who saved her children might just be worth more than all her money combined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of the 2-bedroom apartment at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 3 years. Ben Carter's calloused hand found the snooze button with practiced precision, his body already moving through the familiar choreography of another dawn. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he padded to the small kitchen, where yesterday's coffee mug sat waiting beside a sink that had seen better decades. Through the narrow window above the sink, the city was still wrapped in that peculiar grey light that comes just before sunrise. Not quite night, not quite day. Ben had grown to appreciate these quiet moments before the world demanded his attention. They belonged to him alone. A small pocket of peace before the weight of responsibility settled back onto his shoulders. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with its familiar rhythm. Ben leaned against the counter, running his fingers through hair that showed more grey at the temples than it had when Sarah was alive. 4 years. 4 years since the accident had turned him from a husband and father into just a father. From a man with a partner to face life's challenges into someone who carried them all alone. "Dad?" Tommy's sleepy voice drifted from the bedroom they shared, high and sweet in the morning stillness. "Right here, buddy. Coffee's brewing." The sound of small feet hitting the floor was followed by the rustle of sheets and the soft thud of Tommy's favorite stuffed dinosaur being dragged across the hardwood. At 8 years old, Tommy Carter was all knees and elbows, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn cowlick that refused to lie flat, no matter how much water Ben used each morning. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching both the dinosaur and a worn notebook filled with his latest artistic creation, a hand-drawn comic book featuring Super Dad, a superhero who could fix anything with his magic toolbox and always knew exactly what to say when monsters were hiding. "Under beds. Did you finish the new page?" Ben asked, crouching down to Tommy's level as he did every morning. It was a ritual that had evolved naturally after Sarah's death, this daily check-in that assured both father and son that they were still okay, still together, still managing to build something good from what remained. Tommy nodded enthusiastically, opening the notebook to reveal his latest masterpiece. The drawing showed Superdad rescuing a cat from a tree while simultaneously repairing a broken swing set. The proportions were wildly off, the colors chosen more for enthusiasm than realism, but every line was drawn with the fierce concentration that only children could muster when creating worlds they wished were real. "That's incredible work," Ben said, and meant it. Tommy's imagination was perhaps the one thing in their small apartment that money couldn't improve. It was pure and boundless, unmarked by the practical limitations that shaped Ben's daily decisions about groceries and rent, and whether they could afford new shoes before the old ones fell apart completely. "Super Dad never gets tired," Tommy said, settling at the small kitchen table where they ate all their meals. "And he always has time to play, even after work." Ben felt the familiar tug in his chest, that mixture of love and guilt that had become his constant companion. "Real dads get tired sometimes," he said gently, pouring cereal into 2 bowls. "But they always love you, even when they're tired." "I know," Tommy said matter-of-factly, already absorbed in adding details to his drawing. "That's why you're like Super Dad. You love me even when you have to work late." The conversation that followed was a comfortable dance they'd perfected. Over countless mornings, Tommy chatted about his plans for the day: art class at school, recess with his friend Marcus, the book report that was due Friday, while Ben mentally reviewed his own schedule. The fountain at Meridian Plaza needed its weekly maintenance check. 3 of the planters had irrigation issues, and Mrs. Henderson from the management company had mentioned something about the lighting in the east parking garage flickering again. Meridian Plaza was the kind of upscale shopping center that catered to people who thought nothing of spending Ben's monthly grocery budget on a single handbag. He'd been working there for 2 years now, long enough to become invisible to the steady stream of wealthy shoppers who moved through the gleaming corridors with their designer clothes and easy confidence. They didn't see him. Not really. He was just part of the background, like the polished marble floors and the carefully arranged floral displays. Just another working man in coveralls, doing the kind of job that kept their world running smoothly while remaining beneath their notice. It was honest work, and it paid enough to keep them afloat, though just barely. After rent, utilities, groceries, and Tommy's after-school care, there wasn't much left over. Ben had learned to be creative with meals, to shop for clothes at thrift stores, to fix whatever broke rather than replace it. Tommy never complained. At 8, he seemed to understand instinctively that their life was built on different foundations than those of his classmates. But he'd never made Ben feel like it wasn't enough. The morning routine continued with the precision of a well-rehearsed play. Showers were quick to save hot water. Breakfast was eaten standing up while Ben packed his lunch and Tommy gathered his school supplies. The walk to Edison Elementary took exactly 12 minutes, long enough for Tommy to point out interesting clouds or tell elaborate stories about the adventures his dinosaur had experienced during the night. "Mrs. Patterson says we're going to start learning about family trees next week," Tommy mentioned as they approached the school's front entrance. "We have to draw pictures of all our family members." Ben's step faltered slightly. Family trees were complicated when half the tree was missing. "That sounds like a great project," he managed. "We'll work on it together, okay? Can we put Mom in it, even though she's in heaven?" The question was asked with the straightforward innocence that children brought to life's most difficult topics. Ben knelt down on the sidewalk, ignoring the other parents streaming past them toward the school entrance. "Of course we can put Mom in it," he said. "She's still part of our family, always will be. We just can't see her right now." Tommy nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity he reserved for important matters. "I'll draw her with wings," he decided. "Angel wings, like in the picture by my bed. She'd like that very much." The goodbye hug lasted a little longer than usual, both of them holding on to the moment before the day separated them. Ben watched until Tommy disappeared through the school's front doors, his small backpack bouncing with each step, before turning toward the bus stop that would carry him to another day of invisible labor in someone else's world. The city bus was already crowded with the morning shift, cleaning ladies heading to office buildings, construction workers bound for job sites, retail employees preparing for another day of serving customers who earned more in a month than they did in a year. Ben found a seat near the back and pulled out his own worn notebook, not filled with superhero adventures, but with carefully tracked expenses and job applications for positions that might pay a little more, offer a few more benefits, provide a little more security for the future he was trying to build for Tommy. The drive to Meridian Plaza took 45 minutes through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, the modest apartments and small houses gradually giving way to manicured lawns and gated communities. By the time the bus reached the plaza, Ben had mentally prepared himself for another day of existing in the spaces between other people's lives, fixing what was broken while remaining fundamentally unseen. He clocked in at the maintenance office, collected his tools, and began the familiar rounds that had become second nature. The fountain first, checking water levels and cleaning debris from the filters, then the planters, adjusting sprinkler heads and removing wilted flowers. The work was methodical, requiring attention to detail but leaving plenty of room for his mind to wander. As he worked, the plaza came alive around him. Shop owners arrived to open their boutiques and galleries. The coffee shop began brewing its first batch of expensive lattes. Well-dressed shoppers started their leisurely stroll through corridors, lined with stores that sold things Ben could never afford, but had learned to appreciate from a distance. The craftsmanship of a hand-stitched leather bag, the artistry of a custom-designed piece of jewelry, the simple elegance of clothes that fit perfectly because they were tailored rather than bought off the rack. It was a world that existed parallel to his own, close enough to observe, but separated by invisible barriers of class and circumstance. Ben didn't resent it exactly. These people weren't inherently better or worse than anyone else. They'd simply been born into different circumstances or made different choices or caught breaks that hadn't come his way. What mattered was doing his job well, earning his paycheck honestly, and getting home to Tommy with enough energy left over to be the father his son deserved. The morning passed peacefully. Ben repaired a loose tile near the main entrance, replaced, burnt out bulbs in the parking garage, and cleaned graffiti from the service entrance, where teenagers sometimes gathered after hours. It was routine work, the kind that let his mind drift to weekend plans with Tommy, maybe a trip to the Free Museum or an afternoon at the park if the weather held. He had no way of knowing that this particular Tuesday would be different from all the others, that a split-second decision was approaching that would crack open his carefully ordered world and let something entirely unexpected spill in. The universe rarely announced its intentions in advance. It simply waited, patient and impartial, for the moment when ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary possibilities. For now, though, it was just another morning at Meridian Plaza. Another day of honest work in service of a world that barely noticed he existed. Ben Carter adjusted his tool belt, checked his watch, and continued with his rounds, unaware that everything was about to change. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the plaza's main courtyard, turning the decorative fountain into a shimmering beacon that drew shoppers seeking respite from the heat. Ben had been adjusting the water pressure for 20 minutes. His hands working automatically while his mind wandered to Tommy's upcoming parent-teacher conference and whether he could afford to take time off without losing pay. The plaza buzzed. With its usual Tuesday crowd, mothers pushing designer strollers, business executives grabbing quick lunches between meetings, tourists photographing the carefully curated displays that made everything look effortlessly perfect. Ben had learned to work around the foot traffic, timing his movements to avoid disrupting the carefully orchestrated flow of commerce that kept this place profitable. He was reaching for his wrench when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. In the plaza's symphony of comfortable chatter and clinking coffee cups, high-pitched laughter, too gleeful and too close to the busy street that bordered the plaza's north entrance, Ben's head snapped up, his father's instincts immediately alert. Two toddlers, maybe 3 years old, had somehow wandered away from the main shopping area. They were identical twins, a boy and a girl, both with dark curls and bright red coats that made them look like tiny cardinals against the plaza's neutral palette. The little girl was chasing soap bubbles that drifted. From a nearby toy store, her delighted squeals carrying on the warm air. Her brother followed close behind, stumbling on chubby legs as he tried to catch the iridescent spheres that kept slipping through his small fingers. Ben's blood went cold as he realized their trajectory. The children were heading directly toward the service road that delivery trucks used to access the plaza's loading docks. It wasn't heavily trafficked, but it was still a working road where drivers weren't expecting to encounter wandering toddlers. He looked around frantically for their parents or caregiver, but saw no one nearby who seemed to be searching for missing children. The closest adults were a group of women having lunch at an outdoor cafe, too absorbed in their conversation to notice the drama unfolding 50 yards away. "Hey!" Ben called out, dropping his tools and starting toward the children. "Wait up there!" But toddlers don't respond to strangers' voices the way older children do. If anything, the sound of his call seemed to spur them on, the little boy breaking into a wobbly run as a particularly large bubble floated just out of reach. They were now only 20 feet from the road, close enough that Ben could hear the rumble of an approaching delivery truck somewhere beyond the landscape barrier that separated the shopping area from the service route. Ben's decision was instant and unthinking. He abandoned his post at the fountain, leaving expensive equipment unsecured and his work area in disarray. His work boots pounded against the decorative pavers as he sprinted toward the children, his tool belt jangling with each stride. The little girl reached the edge of the landscaping first, her small hand pushing aside the ornamental grasses that marked the boundary between the plaza and the road. Ben could see the white delivery truck now, moving at a reasonable speed, but clearly not expecting obstacles. The driver was checking something on his clipboard, his attention divided between the road and his paperwork. "Stop!" Ben shouted, though. He wasn't sure whether he was calling to the children or the truck driver. His legs pumped harder, drawing on reserves of speed he hadn't used since high school track. The distance between him and the twins was closing, but not fast enough. The little boy stumbled just as he reached the roadway, his small body tumbling forward onto the warm asphalt. His sister, seeing her twin fall, immediately moved to help him up, both children now directly in the path of the approaching truck. Ben didn't think. Thinking would have meant calculating angles and distances, weighing his own safety against that of children he didn't know. Instead, he simply moved, his body acting on the same primal instinct that had made him check on Tommy 3 times. The night he'd had a fever, the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to work double shifts when money was tight, rather than let his son go without. He hit the asphalt at a full run and scooped both children into his arms, their small bodies, surprisingly solid and warm against his chest. The truck driver had seen them now and was braking hard, but momentum and physics don't respect good intentions. Ben could hear the squeal of brakes, smell the rubber burning against asphalt, feel the heat of the truck's engine as it bore down on them. With the twins clutched against his chest, Ben threw himself sideways, rolling across the rough surface of the road and feeling the truck's bumper brush past his shoulder with inches to spare. They landed hard on the far side of the service road, Ben's body absorbing most of the impact as they tumbled into the decorative gravel that surrounded a cluster of palm trees. For a moment, the world was very quiet. Ben could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel the sharp bite of gravel embedded in his palms and elbows, could smell the twins' baby shampoo and the faint scent of the vanilla cookies someone had been eating nearby. The children were crying now, loud, healthy wails that meant they were more frightened than hurt. "Jesus Christ, are you okay?" The truck driver had jumped from his cab and was running toward them, his face pale with shock. "I didn't see them until... Christ, they came out of nowhere." Ben sat up slowly, checking the children for injuries with hands that shook slightly. From adrenaline, the little girl had a small scrape on her knee where it had hit the pavement, and the boy's red coat was torn at the elbow, but both seemed otherwise unharmed. They clung to Ben with the desperate grip of children who had been genuinely frightened, their tears soaking into his work shirt. "They're okay," Ben managed, his voice rough. "Just scared." "Are you hurt?" he asked the children directly. Though he knew they were probably too young and too upset to give him a reliable answer, that's when he heard the scream. It came from behind him, from the direction of the plaza's main entrance. A woman's voice, high and desperate, calling names he couldn't quite make out over the twins' continued crying. Ben turned to see a figure running toward them. Not the casual jog of someone who had misplaced something, but the all-out sprint of someone in the grip of pure terror. The woman who reached them was younger than Ben had expected, maybe early 30s, with long, dark hair that had come loose from what had probably been a neat ponytail. She was expensively dressed in the effortless way that marked her as belonging to the plaza's usual clientele, but her designer clothes were disheveled and her face was streaked with tears. "Emma! Ethan!" She dropped to her knees beside Ben, her hands reaching for the children with the same desperate urgency Ben had felt just moments before. Oh God, I thought, when I couldn't find you." The twins immediately transferred their attention to her, and Ben realized this must be their mother. The resemblance was clear now that he could see them together. The same dark curls, the same large eyes, the same delicate bone structure that would probably make them heartbreakers in 20 years. "They're fine," Ben said quickly, wanting to reassure her before her panic could spiral higher. "Just a little shaken up, no real injuries, just a scrape or two." The woman looked at him then, really looked at him, and Ben saw the moment when she registered what had happened. Her eyes moved from his torn work shirt to the skid marks on the asphalt to the truck driver who was still standing nearby, looking, shell-shocked. "You saved them," she said, and it wasn't a question. Ben felt embarrassed by the direct gratitude in her voice, the way she was looking at him like he'd done something extraordinary instead of just reacting the way any decent person would have. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he said, starting to stand up. "I'm just glad they're okay." "No," her voice was firm, certain. "Not anyone. Most people would have hesitated or called for help or assumed someone else would handle it. You didn't hesitate." The truck driver had approached during this exchange, his clipboard forgotten in his hand. "I'm going to need to file a report," he said apologetically. "Company policy. Are you sure everyone's okay? Should I call an ambulance?" Ben looked at the children who had stopped crying and were now examining their small scrapes with the fascination the kids brought to minor injuries. "I think they're fine, but it's not my call." He looked at their mother questioningly. She was checking them over with the thoroughness of someone who knew what to look for, her hands gentle but efficient as she examined knees and elbows and asked quiet questions about whether anything hurt. "I think we're okay," she said finally, "but I want our pediatrician to take a look just to be sure." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of activity. The plaza's security team arrived, followed by the manager on duty, a nervous man in an expensive suit who seemed more concerned about liability than about the children's welfare. The truck driver gave his statement to security while Ben explained what he'd seen and done. Through it all, the woman, he still didn't know her name, stayed close to her children, but Ben was aware of her watching him, not in an intrusive way, but with a kind of focused attention that made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being seen, really seen, by people from her world. "I should get back to work," Ben said finally, when it seemed like the immediate crisis had passed. His tools were still scattered around the fountain, and he could see Mrs. Henderson from the management office striding across the plaza with the brisk walk that usually meant someone was in trouble. "Wait," the woman said, standing up with a twin on each hip. "I don't even know your name. I want to thank you properly." "Ben Carter," he said, "and you don't need to thank me. I'm just glad they're safe." "Ben Carter," she repeated like she was committing it to memory. "I'm Juliet Marlowe, and these are Emma and Ethan." Ben nodded politely, though the name meant nothing to him. "Nice to meet you, despite the circumstances." Mrs. Henderson had reached them now, her face set in the expression she wore when dealing with situations that might reflect poorly on the plaza's reputation. "Mr. Carter, I need to speak with you," she said briskly, then turned to Juliet with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, I hope you'll understand that we need to conduct a thorough investigation of this incident for everyone's protection." Ben felt his stomach drop. He'd abandoned his post, left expensive equipment unattended, been involved in what could have been a serious accident. In Mrs. Henderson's world, those facts would matter more than the reason behind them. "I understand," Juliet said, but there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. A coolness that suggested she understood exactly what kind of investigation Mrs. Henderson had in mind. "I'll make sure to give a complete statement about how Mr. Carter saved my children's lives." The emphasis she put on those last words was subtle, but unmistakable. Ben glanced at her, surprised by the steel he heard beneath her polite tone. Mrs. Henderson's smile became even more strained. "Of course, if you'll excuse us, I need to speak with Mr. Carter privately." Ben knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. Good. Intentions punished by bureaucracy. Ordinary people crushed by policies designed to protect institutions rather than individuals. He thought of Tommy, waiting at after-school care, expecting his dad to pick him up with stories about his day and maybe enough energy left over for homework help. "It's okay," he told Juliet quietly. "This isn't your problem." But as Mrs. Henderson led him away toward the management office, Ben heard Juliet's voice behind him, calm and clear. "Actually, I think it might be." He didn't have time to wonder what she meant. Mrs. Henderson was talking about liability and proper procedures and the importance of following protocol, her words washing over him like white noise as he tried to figure out how he was going to explain to Tommy that their carefully balanced life had just gotten a lot more complicated. The termination meeting lasted exactly 15 minutes. Ben's employment was ended effective immediately. His final paycheck would be mailed within 2 weeks, and his personal items from his locker would be sent to his home address. Mrs. Henderson delivered the news with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, professional and distant and utterly indifferent to the human cost of her decision. Ben walked back through the plaza in a daze, past the fountain he'd been repairing when the day had taken its decisive turn, past the shops full of things he couldn't avoid, past the cafe where people were still having leisurely lunches while his world quietly fell apart. He had 3 hours before he needed to pick up Tommy from after-school care. 3 hours to figure out how to tell his 8-year-old son that their already tight budget had just gotten impossibly tighter, that the job security they'd finally achieved was gone, that the future they'd been building together had just become a lot less certain. As he waited for the bus that would carry him back to their modest neighborhood, Ben found himself thinking about the twins' mother, about the way she'd looked at him like he'd done something remarkable, instead of just reacting on instinct. He wondered if she understood what his split-second decision had cost him, and whether she'd think it was worth it if she did. The bus arrived with a wheeze of diesel fumes and squeaking brakes. Ben climbed aboard, found a seat in the back, and began the long ride home to a conversation he didn't want to have with the most important person in his world. Juliet Marlowe sat in the back seat of her black sedan, watching the familiar landscape of Meridian Plaza shrink in the rearview mirror while her twins slept against her shoulders. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past hour was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a shaky exhaustion that made her hands tremble as she smoothed Emma's curls away from her face. The pediatrician had pronounced both children perfectly fine, a few minor scrapes that would heal within days. No signs of concussion or serious trauma. But Juliet knew that the real damage might not be visible on the surface. Emma had clung to her with unusual intensity during the examination, and Ethan had been unusually quiet, his normal chatter replaced by a watchful silence that worried her more than any physical injury could have. Mrs. Marlowe, her driver, Marcus, caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "Shall I take us home?" Home. The word felt strange today, heavy with implications she hadn't considered before. Home was a 15,000-square-foot estate in Windermere Heights, surrounded by gates and security cameras and all the careful barriers she'd constructed between her family and the outside world. It was supposed to be safe, a sanctuary where her children could grow up protected from the chaos that had defined her own childhood. But safety, she was learning, was more complicated than high walls and background checks. Her children had nearly died today, and not because their security had failed or because she'd been careless with their protection. They'd nearly died because they were curious 3-year-olds who saw soap bubbles and wanted to chase them, because the world was full of wonderful things that didn't respect the boundaries she'd tried to draw around them. "Yes," she said quietly. "Take us home." The drive through the city gave her time to think, to process what had happened and what it meant. She'd been in meetings all morning, a video conference with her development team in Singapore, followed by a strategy session with her board of directors about the company's expansion into renewable energy storage. Important meetings, the kind that moved millions of dollars and affected thousands of jobs. The kind of meetings that had built her reputation as one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs of her generation. But none of that had mattered when she'd emerged from the conference room to find her nanny, Eleanor, in tears in the hallway. Outside her office, the security footage would show exactly what had happened, frame by frame. Eleanor had been watching the twins play in the small outdoor area adjacent to the plaza's family center while Juliet finished her meetings. It was a routine they'd established months ago, a safe, enclosed space where the children could get fresh air and exercise while staying close to Juliet's temporary office in the building above the plaza. But 3-year-olds were escape artists by nature, and the family center's gate had a latch that was apparently just within reach of determined small fingers. The footage would show Emma figuring out how to open it, Ethan following his sister with the loyalty that characterized their relationship, both of them drawn by the magical sight of soap bubbles drifting on the afternoon breeze. It would also show Eleanor's moment of realization, her frantic search, her desperate call to building security. And then, most importantly, it would show a maintenance worker abandoning his tools and sprinting toward her children with the kind of focused determination that suggested he understood exactly what was at stake. Ben Carter, she turned the name over in her mind, trying to attach it to the man who had quite literally thrown himself between her children and disaster. He wasn't what she would have expected a hero to look like. Middle-aged, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of years of physical labor. His work clothes had been clean but worn, his tool belt obviously well used, his whole appearance marking him as someone who existed on the periphery of her usual world. But when it had mattered most, when her children's lives hung in the balance, he hadn't hesitated. While she'd been discussing quarterly projections in a climate-controlled conference room, he'd been willing to risk everything for 2 children he didn't even know. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent the last 3 years since her divorce, carefully vetting everyone who came into contact with Emma and Ethan. Nannies underwent extensive background checks. Household staff were bonded and insured. Even the children's playmates were chosen from families she knew personally, parents who moved in the same exclusive circles and understood the unique challenges of raising children in the public eye. Yet, it had been a stranger, someone completely outside her carefully constructed safety net, who had actually saved her children's lives. The sedan turned through the gates of her estate, past the guardhouse where security cameras tracked every vehicle that entered or left the property. The house that came into view was beautiful in the way that expensive architecture could be. All clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows, landscaping that looked natural but required a team of gardeners to maintain its artful casualness. Juliet had bought the property 2 years ago, after the divorce from Richard had been finalized, and she'd needed a place to rebuild her life as a single mother. She'd chosen it for its security features and its privacy, for the way it could shelter her children from the media attention that still followed her despite her efforts to live quietly. But as the car pulled into the circular driveway, she found herself wondering what Ben Carter would think of it. Would he be impressed by the obvious wealth it represented? Or would he see it, the way she was beginning to see it, as an elaborate fortress that might protect her children from some dangers while leaving them vulnerable to others? Elena met them at the front door, her face still pale with the aftermath of the afternoon's crisis. She was a kind woman in her 50s, with grown children of her own, and enough experience with toddlers to handle twins without breaking a sweat under normal circumstances. But today had been far from normal. "How are they?" she asked immediately, reaching for Ethan as Juliet carried both children toward the house. "Physically, they're fine," Juliet said. "Dr. Martinez said just to watch for any signs of delayed reaction, but she doesn't expect any problems. Emotionally," she paused, looking down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. "We'll see." They settled the children in the family room, where familiar toys and books might help restore some sense of normalcy. Emma woke up as soon as Juliet tried to put her down, immediately reaching for her mother with the clingy behavior that sometimes followed stressful experiences. Ethan seemed more interested in his blocks, but Juliet noticed that he stayed closer to her than usual, building his elaborate towers within arm's reach of her chair. "Tell me exactly what happened," Juliet said once the children were settled. She'd heard Elena's initial tearful account, but now she needed details. As a businesswoman, she'd learned that understanding the full picture was essential to preventing future problems. Elena's story was straightforward and heartbreaking in its simplicity. The children had been playing happily in the enclosed area, content with their outdoor toys and the sunshine. Elena had been watching them carefully, as she always did, but she'd also been keeping an eye on the time, knowing that Juliet's meeting was scheduled to end soon. "I turned away for maybe 30 seconds, Elena said, her voice heavy with guilt, just to check my phone for the time. When I looked back, the gate was open and they were gone." Juliet reached over and squeezed the older woman's hand. "It's not your fault," she said firmly. 3-year-olds are escape artists. If there's a way out, they'll find it." But even as she offered comfort, Juliet's mind was working through the implications. How had her security team missed 2 small children, leaving a supposedly secure area? How long had the family center's gate been functioning improperly? How many other potential hazards existed in places she'd assumed were safe? "What do you know about the man who helped them?" she asked. "The maintenance worker?" "Ben Carter," Elena said immediately. "I got his name from the security team. He's worked at the plaza for about 2 years, always seemed very professional. The other staff speak well of him." Juliet filed that information away, then excused herself to make a phone call. Her head of security, David Kim, answered on the first ring. "I've already started the investigation," he said before she could speak. "Full review of the plaza's security protocols, analysis of the footage, interviews with all relevant personnel." "What about Ben Carter?" There was a pause. "What about him?" "I want to know everything. Background check, employment history, personal situation, everything you can find out legally." "Mrs. Marlowe, if you're concerned about his motivations—" "I'm not concerned about his motivations," Juliet interrupted. "I want to understand who he is. The man saved my children's lives, David. I'd like to know more about someone capable of that kind of immediate courage." She could hear David typing on his keyboard. "I'll have a preliminary report within a few hours. Full background check by tomorrow morning." "Thank you. And David, I also want to know what happened to him afterward. I saw the plaza manager pull him aside, and something tells me this story doesn't have a happy ending for him." After ending the call, Juliet returned to the family room, where Emma and Ethan were building an elaborate city out of blocks while Elena supervised from nearby. The scene was peaceful, domestic, exactly the kind of quiet family moment she'd been trying to create for them since the divorce. But she couldn't shake the image of Ben Carter walking away from the plaza with the defeated posture of a man who'd just lost something important. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror during the worst days of her marriage, when Richard's betrayals had been splashed across every gossip website and business journal. It was the look of someone whose good intentions had been punished, whose attempt to do the right thing had cost them dearly. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Initial findings on Ben Carter. Single father, recently widowed, 8-year-old son. Clean record, no red flags. Terminated from plaza employment, effective immediately following this afternoon's incident. Juliet stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Ben Carter had saved her children's lives and lost his job in the process. While she'd been dealing with pediatricians and security protocols, he'd been going home to tell his young son that their already difficult life had just gotten much more complicated. She thought about the way he'd looked when Mrs. Henderson had led him away, resigned but not surprised, like he'd expected this outcome from the moment he'd made the decision to help. Like he'd weighed the cost and decided her children were worth it anyway. Emma looked up from her blocks and smiled at her mother, the same trusting, innocent smile she'd worn that morning before the world had proven itself capable of unexpected dangers. In that smile, Juliet saw all the reasons she'd built walls around their life, all the justifications for the careful control she exercised over every aspect of their daily existence. But she also saw something else, a reminder that the most important protections couldn't be bought or built. They came from people like Ben Carter, who chose to act when action was needed, regardless of the personal cost. Juliet reached for her phone again. There were calls to make, arrangements to set in motion, a debt to repay that went far beyond simple gratitude. Ben Carter had risked everything for her children, and the least she could do was make sure that sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Ben sat at their small kitchen table, staring at the laptop screen that displayed his meager job search options. The afternoon sun slanted through their apartment's single window, highlighting the stack of bills that had seemed manageable yesterday, but now loomed like an insurmountable mountain. 3 days had passed since the incident at the plaza, and the reality of unemployment was settling in with the weight of a lead blanket. Tommy was sprawled on the living room floor, working on his homework with the kind of focused concentration that made Ben's chest tight with pride and worry in equal measure. His son had taken the news of the job loss with the resilience that children sometimes showed in the face of adult problems they didn't fully understand. "So we'll just find you a new job," Tommy had said matter-of-factly when Ben had explained the situation. "Like when the washing machine broke and we had to find a new laundromat. It's just a different kind of problem-solving. If only it were that simple." Ben scrolled through another page of job listings, noting the requirements that put most positions out of reach. Advanced degrees he didn't have, certifications that would cost money he couldn't spare, experience in industries he'd never worked in. The maintenance and facilities jobs that matched his skills were few and far between, and most paid less than what he'd been earning at the plaza. "Dad?" Tommy's voice drifted from the living room. "Can you help me with this math problem?" Ben pushed back from the laptop, grateful for the distraction. Tommy's homework had become one of their evening rituals, a time when Ben could feel useful and competent, even when the rest of life felt like it was spinning out of control. He settled onto the floor beside his son, looking at the worksheet, covered with Tommy's careful handwriting. "What's the problem?" This one about the word problems. It says, "Sarah has 24 apples and wants to divide them equally among 6 friends. How many apples will each friend get? But I keep getting confused about whether Sarah gets apples too, or if she's just giving them all away." Ben smiled, recognizing the kind of logical thinking that made Tommy special. His son didn't just solve problems, he thought about the people in them, wondering about their motivations and feelings. "What do you think?" Ben asked. "If you had 24 apples and 6 friends came over, what would you do?" Tommy considered this seriously. "I'd probably keep some for myself, but I'd share most of them. Maybe give each friend 3 apples and keep 6 for myself. That's good thinking." But in math problems like this, when they say divide equally among 6 friends, they usually mean Sarah isn't included in the division. She's just being generous and giving all the apples away. "That seems kind of sad for Sarah," Tommy said. But he wrote down the answer anyway. 4 apples each. They worked through the rest of the math homework together, Ben helping when Tommy got stuck, but mostly just enjoying the comfortable routine of their evening. This was what mattered, he reminded himself. This quiet time with his son, this partnership they'd built together, this small apartment that might not be much, but was theirs. The knock at the door came as they were finishing up, 3 sharp raps that echoed through their small space. Ben wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare in their building. Most of their neighbors worked multiple jobs or kept to themselves, and Tommy's friends usually called before coming over. Ben looked through the peephole and saw a woman standing in the hallway, her posture uncertain, but her clothes unmistakably expensive. It took him a moment to recognize her, Juliet Marlowe, the twins' mother, looking somehow smaller and more tentative than she had at the plaza. "Tommy, why don't you pack up your homework and get ready for your bath?" Ben said, buying himself a moment to think. He couldn't imagine why she was here, at his apartment, 3 days after the incident. He opened the door, leaving the chain. Latch engaged. "Mrs. Marlowe? Hello, Ben. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I got your address from—" She paused, seeming to realize that mentioning her background check might not be the best way to start this conversation. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened the other day." Ben unlatched the chain and opened the door fully, stepping back to let her in. The contrast between her presence and their modest surroundings was stark. Her designer jeans and cashmere sweater probably cost more than Ben's monthly rent, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. But there was something else in her demeanor, something that reminded him of the terrified mother he'd encountered at the plaza rather than the polished businesswoman who was clearly used to getting what she wanted. "Please sit down," Ben said, gesturing toward their small couch. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "Water would be nice, thank you." Ben busied himself in the kitchen, using the time to compose himself. He filled a glass with tap water, wishing he had something better to offer, but knowing that pretending to be something he wasn't would only make this conversation more awkward. When he returned to the living room, Juliet was looking at Tommy's artwork that covered one wall, crayon drawings of superheroes and dinosaurs, a family portrait that showed just Ben and Tommy holding hands in front of their apartment building, a carefully rendered picture of a woman with wings that Tommy had labeled Mom in Heaven. "Your son is very talented," she said softly. "Thank you. He's a good kid." Ben handed her the water and settled into the chair across from the couch. "How are Emma and Ethan doing?" "They're fine. Physically, anyway. Emma's been having some nightmares, and Ethan won't let me out of his sight. But the doctor says that's normal after a traumatic experience." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them processing the weight of what might have happened if Ben hadn't been there. "I know you lost your job," Juliet said finally, "because of what you did for my children." Ben shrugged, trying to appear casual about something that was actually keeping him awake at night. "That was my choice. I knew what I was risking when I left my post, but you did it anyway. Of course I did. They're just babies. Anyone would have—" "No," Juliet interrupted, her voice firm. "Not anyone. I've been thinking about this for days, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Most people would have hesitated or looked around for someone else to handle it, or assumed that someone else was responsible. You didn't hesitate." Ben felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He wasn't a hero, just a father who'd reacted the way any parent would when children were in danger. "Look, Mrs. Marlowe, I appreciate you coming by, but you don't owe me anything. I'm glad your kids are safe. That's all that matters." "But it's not all that matters," she said, leaning forward with an intensity that surprised him. "You sacrificed your livelihood for my children. That matters to me." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business envelope. "I want to offer you a job." Ben stared at the envelope like it might contain something dangerous. "What kind of job?" "Groundskeeper at my estate. The work would be similar to what you were doing at the plaza: maintenance, landscaping, general upkeep. The pay would be 20% more than you were making before, plus full benefits and housing assistance if you need it." The offer was generous to the point of being overwhelming. Ben knew he should feel grateful, but instead he felt suspicious. People like Juliet Marlowe didn't offer jobs to people like him without expecting something in return. Why? He asked. Because I need someone I can trust around my children, because I've seen what you're willing to do when it matters, because, she paused, seeming to search for the right words, because I think Emma and Ethan could use more people like you in their lives. Ben looked toward the bathroom, where he could hear Tommy splashing in the tub and singing a song he'd learned at school. His son had adapted to their reduced circumstances, without complaint. But Ben wasn't naive about the challenges ahead. Finding another job would take time they didn't have, and the longer he was unemployed, the harder it would become to find anything at all. I'd want to bring Tommy to work sometimes, he said slowly. After school, during breaks. I can't afford full-time childcare. That would be fine. We have plenty of space, and I think it would be good for all the children to have friends. Ben opened the envelope and found a formal job offer printed on expensive letterhead, complete with salary details, benefits package, and start date. It was more money than he'd ever made, doing work he understood, for someone who had already demonstrated that she valued his judgment. But there was something else in the envelope, a single sheet of paper that looked like it had been copied from a file. Ben's own resume, the one he'd submitted to the plaza 2 years ago when he'd been desperate for steady work after Sarah's death. At the bottom, someone had handwritten notes. Widowed, 2021. One child, age 8. No criminal record. References check out. Described as reliable, hardworking, honest. Ben looked up to find Juliet watching him carefully. You had me investigated. I had you researched, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. I don't apologize for that. My children's safety is my first priority. And what did you find? That you're exactly who I thought you were. A good man doing his best to raise his son. Under difficult circumstances, Ben folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. The smart thing would be to accept immediately, to grab this unexpected lifeline and worry about the complications later. But he'd learned to be wary of things that seemed too good to be true. I need to think about it, he said. Juliet nodded, though he could see disappointment in her eyes. Of course. Take all the time you need. My contact information is on the offer letter. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Ben, my children ask about you every day. They want to know if the nice man who helped them is okay. It would mean a lot to them to know that you are. After she left, Ben sat in his quiet apartment and thought about paths not taken, about the strange ways that life could change direction. In a single moment, through the thin walls, he could hear Tommy getting ready for bed, humming the same song he'd been singing in the bath. Whatever he decided, it would affect both of them. But for the first time in 3 days, Ben allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve choosing between paying rent and buying groceries, a future where his son might have opportunities that Ben had never dared to hope for. The job offer sat on the kitchen table beside his laptop, a bridge between the life they had and the life they might be able to build. All he had to do was decide whether he was brave enough to cross it. The Marlowe estate stretched out before Ben, like something from a magazine spread about how the other half lived. Rolling lawns dotted with mature oak trees, professionally designed garden beds that bloomed in carefully orchestrated waves of color, and a house that looked more like a small resort than a family home. The morning sun caught the glass and stone facade, making the whole property shimmer with an otherworldly perfection that seemed almost too pristine to be real. Ben parked his decade-old Honda Civic next to the service entrance, feeling acutely aware of how his practical vehicle looked against the backdrop of manicured luxury. He'd accepted Juliet's offer 3 days ago after a sleepless night weighing the risks against the opportunities. Tommy had been characteristically pragmatic about the decision. It sounds like a good job, Dad, his son had said over breakfast. And maybe I can meet the kids you saved. I want to see if they're okay. Now, standing in front of what would be his workplace for the foreseeable future, Ben wondered if he'd made the right choice. The estate contract in his hands felt heavier than it should. its official language spelling out responsibilities that went far beyond basic maintenance work. He was to be the primary groundskeeper, yes, but also available for general estate maintenance, occasional childcare assistance, and other duties as needed, a phrase that could mean almost anything. Mr. Carter, a woman approached from the direction of the main house, her stride confident and professional. She was older than Juliet, maybe late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and clothes that managed to look both elegant and practical. "I'm Sarah Chen, the estate manager. Mrs. Marlowe asked me to show you around and get you settled." Ben shook her offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested she was used to running things efficiently. "Nice to meet. You please call me Ben." "Ben it is. Shall we start with the tour?" The next hour passed in a blur of information as Sarah walked him through the grounds. The property was larger than Ben had initially realized. 15 acres of gardens, lawns, and wooded areas, plus a guest house, pool complex, and what Sarah referred to as the children's outdoor play area, which looked like something Disney might have designed for a particularly wealthy family. "Mrs. Marlowe believes in giving Emma and Ethan space to explore safely," Sarah explained, as they walked past an elaborate playground complete with tree houses, zip lines, and a sandbox that was probably larger than Ben's entire apartment. "But she also wants to make sure they have opportunities to experience nature, get dirty, learn how things grow." Ben nodded, thinking about Tommy's excitement when he'd found a patch of wildflowers growing behind their apartment building. His son would probably think this place was paradise. "The previous groundskeeper retired last month," Sarah continued, leading him toward a well-equipped maintenance shed. "He'd been with the family for 8 years, so there's a lot of institutional knowledge to transfer. But Mrs. Marlowe was very specific that she wanted someone who understood children, who would see this place through their eyes." They stopped at the maintenance building, where Ben found tools and equipment that represented more money than he'd earned in the past 2 years. Professional-grade lawn mowers, a small tractor, irrigation systems that looked like they belonged on a golf course, and storage areas organized with the kind of precision that spoke of serious investment in maintaining the property. "This is impressive," Ben said, running his hand over a riding mower that probably cost more than his car was worth. "Mrs. Marlowe doesn't do anything halfway," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "She believes that taking care of something properly from the beginning saves time and money in the long run." As they continued the tour, Ben began to understand the scope of what he'd signed up for. This wasn't just maintaining a large yard. It was curating an environment where every detail had been considered, where beauty and functionality existed in perfect balance. The gardens alone represented years of planning and thousands of dollars in mature plantings, while the infrastructure, irrigation, lighting, security systems, was more sophisticated than anything he'd worked with before. "Questions so far?" Sarah asked as they approached the main house. "Plenty," Ben admitted, "but I think I understand the basics. This is about creating a space where children can be children while keeping everything beautiful and safe." "Exactly. Mrs. Marlowe will be relieved to hear you get it so quickly." The main house was even more impressive up close, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the gardens from every angle. As they walked around the exterior, Ben caught glimpses of the interior. High ceilings, modern furniture arranged in comfortable groupings, and everywhere the evidence of family life with small children. Toys scattered across expensive rugs, small handprints on glass doors, and the kind of organized chaos that came with toddlers who had unlimited space to explore. "The family spends most of their time in the kitchen and family room," Sarah explained, pointing to a wing of the house that faced the children's play area. "Mrs. Marlowe likes to be able to see the children when they're outside, but she also wants them to feel like they have independence." Ben was beginning to see how thoughtfully everything had been designed, how the entire estate reflected someone who understood both the need for security and the importance of freedom. It was helicopter parenting on a grand scale, but done with enough subtlety that the children probably didn't feel watched or restricted. "When will I meet Mrs. Marlowe?" he asked. "Actually, she's watching us right now," Sarah said with amusement, nodding toward a window where Ben caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. "She's nervous about how you'll react to all this. I think she's worried you'll decide it's too much and change your mind." Ben looked up at the window, where Juliet's figure had already disappeared. He understood her concern. The scale of wealth represented by this property was overwhelming, the kind of luxury that made his own life look almost impoverished by comparison. But he also understood that money hadn't protected her children from danger any more than his lack of money had prevented him from helping them. "It's definitely more than I expected," he said honestly. "But the work is still the work. Grass needs cutting, plants need watering, children need safe spaces to play. The scale is bigger, but the principles are the same." Sarah smiled approvingly. "I think you're going to fit in well here." They finished the tour at the guest house, a smaller but still elegant building that Sarah explained was available for Ben's use if he ever needed to work late or wanted to bring Tommy for overnight stays during school breaks. "Mrs. Marlowe mentioned that you have a son," Sarah said. "She's hoping he'll feel comfortable here, maybe become friends with Emma and Ethan." Ben thought about Tommy's excitement when he described the job offer, how his son had immediately started planning all the adventures he might have in such a large space. "I think he'd like that. He's been the only child in our family for a while now. Having other kids around might be good for him." As they walked back toward the main house, Ben noticed movement in the children's play area. Emma and Ethan were racing around the playground with the boundless energy of 3-year-olds, their laughter carrying on the morning air. A woman Ben didn't recognize was supervising them, probably the nanny, Elena, whom Juliet had mentioned. "They're beautiful children," Ben said, watching the twins navigate a complex climbing structure with the fearless confidence that made parents' hearts stop. "They're wonderful kids," Sarah agreed. "Smart, curious, full of life, but they've been through a lot of changes in the past couple of years. The divorce was hard on everyone, and Mrs. Marlowe has been very focused on giving them stability." Ben heard the subtext in her words, that his presence here represented another change in the children's carefully managed world, and that how well he integrated into their routine would affect more than just the appearance of the gardens. "I should probably introduce myself," he said. The Marlowe estate stretched out before Ben, like something from a magazine spread about how the other half lived. Rolling lawns dotted with mature oak trees, professionally designed garden beds that bloomed in carefully orchestrated waves of color, and a house that looked more like a small resort than a family home. The morning sun caught the glass and stone facade, making the whole property shimmer with an otherworldly perfection that seemed almost too pristine to be real. Ben parked his decade-old Honda Civic next to the service entrance, feeling acutely aware of how his practical vehicle looked against the backdrop of manicured luxury. He'd accepted Juliet's offer 3 days ago after a sleepless night weighing the risks against the opportunities. Tommy had been characteristically pragmatic about the decision. "It sounds like a good job, Dad," his son had said over breakfast. "And maybe I can meet the kids you saved. I want to see if they're okay." Now, standing in front of what would be his workplace for the foreseeable future, Ben wondered if he'd made the right choice. The estate contract in his hands felt heavier than it should, its official language spelling out responsibilities that went far beyond basic maintenance work. He was to be the primary groundskeeper, yes, but also available for general estate maintenance, occasional childcare assistance, and other duties as needed. A phrase that could mean almost anything. "Mr. Carter?" A woman approached from the direction of the main house, her stride confident and professional. She was older than Juliet, maybe late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that managed to look both elegant and practical. "I'm Sarah Chen, the estate manager. Mrs. Marlowe asked me to show you around and get you settled." Ben shook her offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested she was used to running things efficiently. "Nice to meet. You please call me Ben. Ben it is. Shall we start with the tour?" The next hour passed in a blur of information as Sarah walked him through the grounds. The property was larger than Ben had initially realized. 15 acres of gardens, lawns, and wooded areas, plus a guest house, pool complex, and what Sarah referred to as the children's outdoor play area, which looked like something Disney might have designed for a particularly wealthy family. Mrs. Marlowe believes in giving Emma and Ethan space to explore safely, Sarah explained as they walked past an elaborate playground complete with tree houses, zip lines, and a sandbox that was probably larger than Ben's entire apartment. But she also wants to make sure they have opportunities to experience nature, get dirty, learn how things grow. Ben nodded, thinking about Tommy's excitement when he'd found a patch of wildflowers growing behind their apartment building. His son would probably think this place was paradise. "The previous groundskeeper retired last month," Sarah continued, leading him toward a well-equipped maintenance shed. "He'd been with the family for 8 years, so there's a lot of institutional knowledge to transfer. But Mrs. Marlowe was very specific that she wanted someone who understood children, who would see this place through their eyes." They stopped at the maintenance building, where Ben found tools and equipment that represented more money than he'd earned in the past 2 years. Professional-grade lawn mowers, a small tractor, irrigation systems that looked like they belonged on a golf course, and storage areas organized with the kind of precision that spoke of serious investment in maintaining the property. "This is impressive," Ben said, running his hand over a riding mower that probably cost more than his car was worth. "Mrs. Marlowe doesn't do anything halfway," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "She believes that taking care of something properly, from the beginning, saves time and money in the long run." As they continued the tour, Ben began to understand the scope of what he'd signed up for. This wasn't just maintaining a large yard, it was curating an environment where every detail had been considered, where beauty and functionality existed in perfect balance. The gardens alone represented years of planning and thousands of dollars in mature plantings, while the infrastructure, irrigation, lighting, security systems was more sophisticated than anything he'd worked with before. "Questions so far?" Sarah asked as they approached the main house. "Plenty," Ben admitted, "but I think I understand the basics. This is about creating a space where children can be children while keeping everything beautiful and safe." "Exactly. Mrs. Marlowe will be relieved to hear you get it so quickly." The main house was even more impressive up close, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the gardens from every angle. As they walked around the exterior, Ben caught glimpses of the interior, high ceilings, modern furniture arranged in comfortable groupings, and everywhere the evidence of family life with small children. Toys scattered across expensive rugs, small handprints on glass doors, and the kind of organized chaos that came with toddlers who had unlimited space to explore. "The family spends most of their time in the kitchen and family room," Sarah explained, pointing to a wing of the house that faced the children's play area. "Mrs. Marlowe likes to be able to see the children when they're outside, but she also wants them to feel like they have independence." Ben was beginning to see how thoughtfully everything had been designed, how the entire estate reflected someone who understood both the need for security and the importance of freedom. It was helicopter parenting on a grand scale, but done with enough subtlety that the children probably didn't feel watched or restricted. "When will I meet Mrs. Marlowe?" he asked. "Actually, she's watching us right now," Sarah said with amusement, nodding toward a window where Ben caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. "She's nervous about how you'll react to all this. I think she's worried you'll decide it's too much and change your mind." Ben looked up at the window, where Juliet's figure had already disappeared. He understood her concern. The scale of wealth represented by this property was overwhelming, the kind of luxury that made his own life look almost impoverished by comparison. But he also understood that money hadn't protected her children from danger any more than his lack of money had prevented him from helping them. "It's definitely more than I expected," he said honestly, "but the work is still the work. Grass needs cutting, plants need watering, children need safe spaces to play. The scale is bigger, but the principles are the same." Sarah smiled approvingly. "I think you're going to fit in well here." They finished the tour at the guest house, a smaller but still elegant building that Sarah explained was available for Ben's use if he ever needed to work late or wanted to bring Tommy for overnight stays during school breaks. "Mrs. Marlowe mentioned that you have a son," Sarah said. "She's hoping he'll feel comfortable here, maybe become friends with Emma and Ethan." Ben thought about Tommy's excitement when he'd described the job offer, how his son had immediately started planning all the adventures he might have in such a large space. "I think he'd like that. He's been the only child in our family for a while now. Having other kids around might be good for him." As they walked back toward the main house, Ben noticed movement in the children's play area. Emma and Ethan were racing around the playground with the boundless energy of 3-year-olds, their laughter carrying on the morning air. A woman Ben didn't recognize was supervising them, probably the nanny, Elena, whom Juliet had mentioned. "They're beautiful children," Ben said, watching the twins navigate a complex climbing structure with the fearless confidence that made parents' hearts stop. "They're wonderful kids," Sarah agreed. "Smart, curious, full of life, but they've been through a lot of changes in the past couple of years. The divorce was hard on everyone, and Mrs. Marlowe has been very focused on giving them stability." Ben heard the subtext in her words, that his presence here represented another change in the children's carefully managed world, and that how well he integrated into their routine would affect more than just the appearance of the gardens. "I should probably introduce myself," he said. "Actually, Mrs. Marlowe wanted to handle that herself. She'll be out in a moment." As if summoned by their conversation, Juliet emerged from the house, looking more relaxed than she had during their meeting at his apartment. She was dressed casually in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger and less intimidating than the polished businesswoman who'd appeared at his door. "Ben," she said, approaching with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, "I hope the tour hasn't been too overwhelming." "It's impressive," he said honestly. "I can see why the children love it here. That was always the goal. I wanted them to have space to explore safely, to experience the kind of childhood I never had." She paused, seeming to realize she'd revealed more than she'd intended. "Sarah's probably covered most of the practical details, but I wanted to talk to you about the more personal aspects of the job." They walked toward the play area, where Emma and Ethan had noticed their mother's approach and were running toward her with the single-minded determination of children who'd been separated from their parent for more than 5 minutes. "Ben's here," Juliet announced as the twins reached them. "Remember the nice man who helped you at the plaza?" Emma and Ethan studied Ben with the solemn intensity that small children brought to important evaluations. They clearly remembered him, but seeing him in their home territory seemed to require a new assessment of who he was and what his presence might mean for their world. "Are you going to live here now?" Emma asked, taking the direct approach that was characteristic of her personality. "I'm going to work here," Ben said, crouching down to their level. "I'll take care of the gardens and make sure everything stays beautiful for you to play in." "Can your little boy come play too?" Ethan asked, apparently having been briefed on Ben's family situation. Ben glanced up at Juliet, who nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes he can. His name is Tommy, and he's 8 years old. He likes to draw pictures and build things." "We like to build things too," Emma said seriously. "We're very good at it." The conversation that followed was conducted in the straightforward way that children approached new relationships, with curiosity, honesty, and an assumption that friendship was the natural state of things. Ben found himself relaxing as he talked with Emma and Ethan, remembering how much he enjoyed the company of children when he wasn't worried about keeping them safe from immediate danger. After a few minutes, Elena called the twins back to their play, and Ben was left alone with Juliet for the first time since accepting her job offer. "They like you," she said, watching her children return to their elaborate game. "That's not always a given. They can be pretty selective about adults. They're great kids. I can see a lot of their mother in them." Juliet looked at him sharply, and Ben realized his comment could be interpreted in ways he hadn't intended. "I just meant they're thoughtful," he said quickly. "They think before they act, consider other people's feelings. Those are good qualities." "Thank you," she said softly. "I worry sometimes that I'm too protective, that I'm not giving them enough independence. But after what happened at the plaza—" "You're doing fine," Ben said. "They feel safe and loved. That's what matters most." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Emma and Ethan navigate their playground kingdom with the confidence of children who knew they were home. Ben could feel the weight of the estate contract in his pocket, the formal document that outlined his responsibilities and salary and benefits. But he was beginning to understand that the real job description was more complex than anything that could be written down. He was being hired not just to maintain a property, but to be part of a world where two small children could grow up feeling secure enough to chase soap bubbles without considering the consequences. 3 weeks into his new routine, Ben had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He arrived at the estate each morning at 7, just as the dew was lifting from the carefully maintained lawns, and the children were finishing their breakfast in the bright kitchen that overlooked the gardens. The work itself was more varied than he'd expected. Part horticulturist, part handyman, part safety inspector for an elaborate playground that seemed to grow more complex every time he looked at it. Tommy had visited twice now, once on a Saturday, when Ben had needed to repair the irrigation system, and again the previous afternoon, when school had been dismissed early for a teacher conference. Both times, he'd been absorbed almost immediately into Emma and Ethan's world, his 8-year-old maturity making him a natural leader for games that required someone who could read instructions and settle disputes. Today was different, though. Ben could sense it from the moment he arrived and found Juliet waiting for him by the maintenance shed, her posture tense in a way that suggested something was troubling her. She was dressed for work in a crisp business suit, but her hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "Good morning," Ben said, setting down his coffee and noting the way she startled slightly at his voice. "Everything okay?" "I need to ask you a favor," she said without preamble. "Elena called in sick this morning, and I have a video conference with our Tokyo office that I can't reschedule. Would you be able to keep an eye on Emma and Ethan for a couple of hours? They can play outside while you work, and I'll be right inside if anything urgent comes up." Ben was already nodding before she finished speaking. "Of course, we'll be fine." Relief flooded her face so quickly that Ben realized she'd been genuinely worried he might say no. "Thank you. I know it's not technically part of your job description, but it's not a problem," Ben interrupted gently. "Really, I like spending time with them." An hour later, Ben was working on pruning the rose garden, while Emma and Ethan helped by collecting the fallen clippings in a small wagon they'd commandeered for the task. The morning had started with an elaborate explanation of their game, something involving a magical kingdom where roses held special powers and careful gardening was necessary to keep the magic strong. "Ben," Emma's voice was serious as she approached, with a particularly perfect pink bloom that had fallen from his pruning. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure thing, sweetheart. Do you miss your wife?" The question hit Ben like a physical blow, unexpected and sharp. He sat back on his heels, buying himself a moment to process both the question and the matter-of-fact way Emma had asked it. At 3, she was too young to fully understand death, but clearly old enough to understand that some people who should be present in families were sometimes missing. "I do miss her," Ben said carefully. "Very much. But I'm glad I have all the good memories of her, and I'm glad I have Tommy to remind me of all the things she taught us." Emma nodded solemnly. processing this information with the gravity she brought to important matters. "Mommy misses Daddy sometimes too, but she says he wasn't very nice to us, so it's better that he doesn't live here anymore." Ben felt his chest tighten at the casual way Emma shared this information, and at the glimpse it provided into the more complicated story behind Juliet's single motherhood. He'd assumed she was divorced, but he hadn't considered what kind of marriage would end with a mother feeling relieved that her children's father was no longer part of their daily lives. "That must have been confusing for you," he said gently. "A little bit, but Ethan and I decided we like it better when Mommy smiles more." The simple wisdom in her statement made Ben's throat tight with emotion. These children had already learned lessons about relationships and happiness that some adults never figured out, and they'd done it with the resilience that seemed to be their natural response to life's complications. "Your mommy seems very happy now," Ben said. "She is, especially since you came to work here. She laughs more when you're around." Before Ben could figure out how to respond to that observation, Ethan came running over with news that a butterfly had landed on the playground and they needed to investigate immediately. The conversation shifted to more typical 3-year-old concerns, whether butterflies were magic, if they could understand human language, and why they chose some flowers over others. The morning passed peacefully, with Ben managing to complete most of his planned tasks while keeping one eye on the children's elaborate games. They were remarkably self-sufficient for their age, clearly accustomed to entertaining themselves while maintaining the kind of safety awareness that came from good parenting rather than rigid rules. Around 11, Juliet emerged from the house, looking more relaxed than she had earlier. The video conference had apparently gone well, and she moved with the satisfied efficiency of someone who'd successfully handled a challenging professional situation. "How did everything go?" she asked, approaching the garden where Ben was installing a new sprinkler head while Emma and Ethan constructed an elaborate mud pie kitchen nearby. "Perfect," Ben said honestly. "They're great helpers, and they've been teaching me about the magical properties of various plants." "The magical properties?" Juliet's eyebrow raised in amusement. "Apparently roses hold protective spells, and the lavender can make people dream about flying," Ethan explained seriously, overhearing the conversation. "Ben knows about garden magic too. Is that so?" Juliet looked at Ben with a smile that made something warm settle in his chest. "I'm learning," Ben said. "It's more complicated than regular gardening, but the principles are similar." They were interrupted by Elena's arrival. She looked pale but determined, apologizing profusely for the morning's absence, and immediately moving to collect the children for lunch and quiet time. As Emma and Ethan protested the end of their garden adventures, Juliet walked with Ben toward the maintenance shed. "Thank you again for this morning," she said. "I know watching children wasn't what you signed up for." "Actually, it was," Ben said, pulling the estate contract from his work area. "Other duties as needed, remember. Besides, I enjoyed it. They're wonderful kids." As he spoke, Ben was aware of Juliet noticing something else in his work area, a small framed photograph that he'd placed on the workbench next to his tools. It was a family photo from Tommy's second birthday, showing Ben, Sarah, and baby. Tommy in front of their old apartment. Sarah was laughing at something off camera, her arms wrapped around both her boys, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed to light her up from within. Juliet's expression softened as she took in the image. "She was beautiful," she said quietly. She was. Ben picked up the photo, running his thumb over the glass. "This was about 6 months before she got sick. One of the last really good days we had as a family before everything changed. You must have loved her very much." "I did. Still do, I suppose. You don't really stop loving someone just because they're gone." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts about love and loss and the complicated ways that families were built and rebuilt and sometimes broken apart. "Emma told me something interesting this morning," Ben said finally. "She said you seem happier lately, especially since I started working here." Juliet's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. Emma is very observant for a 3-year-old. Is she right? Juliet considered the question seriously, her gaze moving from the photo in Ben's hands to his face and back again. I think I am happier. It's been a long time since I've had someone around who... She paused, seeming to search for the right words. Someone who sees the children the way you do, who enjoys their company without expecting anything in return. Their father didn't. The question slipped out before Ben could stop it, too personal and direct for the careful professional relationship they'd been maintaining. But instead of pulling back, Juliet seemed to relax slightly, as if she'd been waiting for someone to ask. Richard loved them in his way, she said carefully, but he saw them more as extensions of himself than as individuals. Their achievements reflected well on him, their mistakes embarrassed him. He never seemed to just enjoy being with them the way you do. Ben thought about the easy affection he'd observed between Juliet and her children, the way they sought her out throughout the day for hugs and conversations, and the simple comfort of her presence. It was hard to imagine anyone not being completely enchanted by Emma's serious questions and Ethan's infectious enthusiasm. His loss, Ben said simply. That's exactly what I think now, but it took me a long time to see it that way. A comfortable quiet settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of the children's voices from inside the house and the gentle hum of the irrigation system Ben had just repaired. For the first time since accepting this job, Ben allowed himself to acknowledge the growing attraction he felt toward Juliet. Not just her beauty, which was undeniable, but her intelligence, her devotion to her children, and the way she seemed to genuinely value his presence in their lives. But he also understood the impossibility of acting on those feelings. She was his employer. She lived in a world he barely understood, and most importantly, both of them had children whose stability and happiness had to come before any personal desires their parents might develop. I should get back to work, Ben said finally, placing the photo back on the workbench. The sprinkler system in the rose garden needs some attention, and I want to finish before it gets too hot. Of course, Juliet agreed, but she made no immediate move to leave. Instead, she stood looking at the photo for another moment, her expression thoughtful. Ben, she said as he gathered his tools, would you and Tommy like to stay for dinner sometime this week? Nothing formal, just family dinner. I think the children would enjoy it, and it would give me a chance to thank you properly for everything you've done. The invitation was casual, but Ben could hear the slight nervousness in her voice, as if she were asking for something more significant than a simple meal. I think Tommy would love that, he said. And so would I. Good. How about Thursday? I'll cook something simple and we can eat outside if the weather's nice. As Juliet walked back toward the house, Ben found himself thinking about the family photo and the conversation they'd just shared. For the first time in years, he was beginning to imagine what it might feel like to be part of something larger than just him and Tommy, to belong to a family where laughter came easily and where being together was enough. The dinner had been perfect. That was Ben's first thought when he woke up the following Monday morning, his mind immediately returning to Thursday evening's easy conversation and shared laughter around Juliet's outdoor dining table. Tommy had charmed everyone with his stories about school. Emma and Ethan had demonstrated their latest playground innovations, and for a few hours the 5 of them had felt like something that might, in another universe, be called a family. Ben was humming as he prepared his morning coffee, already looking forward to another day at the estate, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Carter? This is Janet Walsh from Channel 7 News. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your relationship with Juliet Marlowe. Ben's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. I'm sorry, what? We're running a story about Ms. Marlowe's new romantic interest, and we'd love to get your perspective on how the relationship developed. Is it true that you met when you saved her children from a traffic accident? I don't know what you're talking about, Ben said slowly. his mind racing to understand how a news reporter had gotten his phone number, let alone information about his connection to Juliet. "Ms. Marlowe is my employer, that's all. Come now." "Mr. Carter, we have photographs of you having dinner together, spending time with her children. Our sources indicate that this relationship has been developing for several weeks." Ben felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Photographs. Someone had been watching them, documenting their private moments, turning Thursday's perfect evening into something that could be twisted into public entertainment. "No comment," he managed, ending the call with shaking hands. Within minutes, his phone was ringing again and again. Different numbers, different reporters, all asking variations of the same questions about his relationship with one of the city's most prominent businesswomen. Ben turned off his phone and tried to think clearly, but his mind kept returning to the implications of what was happening. By the time he arrived at the estate, 20 minutes later than usual, Ben could see that the situation was worse than he'd imagined. 3 news vans were parked on the street outside the gates, their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers reaching toward the sky. Photographers with long lenses clustered near the entrance, and Ben could see reporters doing live broadcasts. With the Marlowe estate as their backdrop, the security guard at the gate waved Ben through with an expression that suggested this wasn't the first media circus he'd dealt with, but Ben could see the strain in his face as he spoke into his radio, probably reporting Ben's arrival to someone inside the house. Ben parked near the maintenance shed and was walking toward the main house when Juliet appeared at the back door. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself like someone preparing for battle. "Ben!" she called, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed took place in Juliet's home office, an elegantly appointed room that managed to feel both professional and comfortable. But there was nothing comfortable about the tabloid magazine that lay open on her desk, its glossy pages displaying photographs that made Ben's chest tighten with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. There was Thursday's dinner, shot through the telephoto lens with the kind of intimate framing that made their family meal look like a romantic rendezvous. There was a picture of him lifting Emma onto his shoulders while Juliet watched with a smile, captioned as "New love helps billionaire, single, mom find happiness." And most invasively, there was a photograph of Ben and Juliet standing close, together in the garden, their body language suggesting an intimacy that had been more imagined by the photographer than real. "How long have they been watching us?" Ben asked, his voice rough with anger. "Probably since the day I visited your apartment," Juliet said, her tone flat with exhaustion. "I should have anticipated this, should have warned you what my life is like, what being associated with me means." Ben sank into the chair across from her desk, his mind reeling with the implications. "What does this mean for my job? For Tommy, it means everything just got much more complicated." Juliet's phone had been ringing constantly since she'd arrived. In the office, each call bringing news of new developments in what was apparently becoming a major story. Her publicist, her attorney, her head of security, everyone wanted to discuss strategy and damage control and the best way to manage a situation that seemed to be spiraling beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The story's already been picked up by 3 major networks, she said, scrolling through messages on her computer. Social media is calling it everything from a modern fairy tale to a calculated publicity stunt. The company's stock price is fluctuating based on speculation. About my personal life, Ben thought about Tommy, probably just arriving at school, blissfully unaware that his father had become the subject of gossip and speculation. "What do we do?" "I don't know yet. My team is working on a response, but this kind of story tends to take on a life of its own." Juliet looked up from her computer, her face pale with stress. "Ben, I'm so sorry. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid by keeping my personal life private." Before Ben could respond, Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her usually composed expression showing cracks of strain. Mrs. Marlowe, there are reporters at the school asking questions about the children. Security is handling it, but you should know. The mention of Emma and Ethan snapped something into focus for Ben. This wasn't just about him anymore, or even about Juliet. The media attention was affecting children who had no say in the matter, who were too young to understand why strangers were suddenly interested in their family. "Have you talked to the kids about what's happening?" he asked. "Elena's keeping them inside today, but they know something's wrong. Emma keeps asking why there are so many cars outside, and Ethan wanted to know if we're in trouble." Ben's phone, which he'd turned back on during the drive to the estate, buzzed with a text from Tommy's school. "Please call regarding urgent matter concerning Tommy Carter." His blood ran cold. "I need to make a call," Ben said, stepping into the hallway. The conversation with Tommy's principal was brief and devastating. Reporters had shown up at Edison Elementary asking questions about Ben and his relationship with Juliet Marlowe. While the school had refused to allow any interviews, the disruption had been significant enough that several parents had called asking whether their children were safe. Tommy himself had been pulled from class twice to speak with the principal about reporters who had tried to approach him on the playground. "We're handling the situation," Principal Martinez assured Ben, "but I think it would be best if Tommy stayed home for a few days until this settles down." Ben ended the call, feeling like the walls were closing in around him. In less than 24 hours, his life had gone from quietly hopeful to completely exposed. His privacy stripped away by people who saw his personal relationships as entertainment. He returned to Juliet's office. He found her on another call, her voice carefully controlled as she spoke to what sounded like a legal team about privacy laws and harassment policies. She looked up when he entered, and he saw his own stress reflected in her eyes. "Tommy's school wants him to stay home," Ben said when she ended the call. Reporters tried to talk to him. Juliet's face went white. "Oh God, Ben, I never intended—" "I know," Ben said quickly. "This isn't your fault. But we need to figure out how to protect the kids." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Ben had ever experienced. Juliet's team included specialists in crisis management, media relations, and personal security, professionals who dealt with these situations as routine business problems. They discussed response strategies, legal options, and the best ways to minimize long-term damage to both Juliet's reputation and Ben's privacy. But as Ben listened to conversations about non-disclosure agreements and media blackouts and carefully crafted public statements, he realized that his simple life had been fundamentally altered. Even if the immediate crisis passed, he would always be the groundskeeper who dated the billionaire, a footnote in someone else's public story. There is one option. Juliet's publicist, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres, said during a pause in the strategizing, "If you're truly just employer and employee, Ben could give a statement clarifying the nature of your relationship. Emphasize the professional boundaries, maybe mention his dedication to his son and his job. It might take some of the romance out of the story." Ben looked at Juliet, seeing the hope and regret warring in her expression. It would be the smart thing to do, the practical choice that would protect both their reputations and, more importantly, their children. But it would also mean lying about feelings that had been growing between them, denying a connection that had felt more real and meaningful than anything Ben had experienced since Sarah's death. "That might work," Juliet said carefully, her tone neutral in a way that told Ben she was leaving the decision entirely up to him. Ben thought about Tommy, probably sitting in their apartment right now, wondering why his father's life had suddenly become the subject of strangers' interest. He thought about Emma and Ethan, confined indoors because their family's privacy had been violated. And he thought about the possibility of building something genuine with Juliet, weighed against the cost of that possibility to everyone he cared about. "Let me think about it," Ben said finally. "I need to talk to Tommy first. Make sure he understands what's happening." As he left the estate that afternoon, navigating past the cameras and shouted questions from reporters, Ben realized that the comfortable rhythm he'd found in his new life had been shattered. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. To the quiet anonymity that had once defined his existence, the story was out now, their private moments transformed into public speculation. The question was whether the connection he'd felt with Juliet was strong enough to survive the scrutiny, or whether the smart thing would be to step back before the cost became too high for any of them to bear. The phone call that changed everything came on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the media storm had begun. Ben was sitting at his kitchen table, nursing his third cup of coffee, while Tommy worked on a puzzle nearby, when his phone rang. With a number he recognized, but had hoped never to see again. "Ben, it's Margaret Collins." The voice of his former mother-in-law was crisp and professional, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "I think we need to talk." Ben's stomach clenched. Margaret and her husband Robert had been largely absent from Tommy's life since Sarah's funeral, their grief over losing their daughter manifesting as a cold distance from their grandson that had hurt Ben more than their occasional criticism of his parenting choices. "What can I do for you, Margaret?" "I think you know why I'm calling. Robert and I have been following the news coverage of your situation with that woman. We're concerned about Tommy's welfare." Ben closed his eyes, feeling the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. "Tommy is fine. He's safe, he's loved, and he's not being affected by any of this media nonsense. Isn't he? Because from what we've seen, he's being dragged into a very public spectacle involving a woman who attracts the kind of attention that's hardly appropriate for a young child." The conversation that followed was worse than Ben's worst fears. Margaret and Robert had consulted with an attorney about their grandparents' rights, armed with newspaper clippings and social media screenshots that painted Ben's new job as evidence of poor judgment and inappropriate priorities. The tabloid photos that had looked invasive and embarrassing to Ben apparently looked like something else entirely to grandparents who had convinced themselves that their grandson was being neglected. "We're not trying to take Tommy away from you," Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We just think he might be better off with us until this situation stabilizes. Robert and I can provide a stable, private environment without the complications of your current employment situation." Ben looked across the kitchen at Tommy, who was humming quietly as he worked on his puzzle, completely unaware that his entire world was being discussed and dissected by adults whose decisions could reshape his future. "Tommy is not leaving me," Ben said firmly, "and if you try to pursue this legally, you'll be hearing from my attorney." "We hoped it wouldn't come to that," Margaret replied, "but we have to consider what's best for Tommy. And honestly, Ben, do you really think this is the kind of environment Sarah would have wanted for her son?" The invocation of Sarah's name hit Ben like a physical blow, not just because of the pain it caused, but because of the calculated cruelty behind it. Margaret knew exactly how to wound him, understood that questioning his adherence to Sarah's values was the one attack he couldn't easily defend against. After ending the call, Ben sat in his quiet kitchen and tried to think clearly about impossible choices. The smart thing would be to distance himself from Juliet immediately, to give Margaret and Robert no ammunition for their custody challenge. But the thought of abandoning the job he'd grown to love, the children who had become important to him, and the woman who had begun to matter more than he'd expected to feel sick with loss. His phone buzzed with a text from Juliet. "Can you come in today? Need to discuss some developments with the legal situation." Ben looked at Tommy, who had finished his puzzle and was now drawing in his ever-present notebook. "Hey, buddy, want to come to work with me today? We might need to have some important conversations." "Is everything okay, Dad?" Tommy asked, his 8-year-old intuition picking up on the tension Ben was trying to hide. "I hope so," Ben said honestly, "but whatever happens, we're going to handle it together, okay?" The drive to the Marlowe estate felt different today. The Media presence had diminished somewhat over the past week, but Ben could still see photographers stationed near the entrance, their cameras ready to capture any new developments in what had become an ongoing story. The security guard who waved them through looked tired, like someone who'd been dealing with unwanted attention for too long. Juliet was waiting for them in the family room, where Emma and Ethan immediately claimed Tommy for an elaborate game, involving their collection of action figures. But Ben could see the strain in her face, the way she held herself, like someone bracing for bad news. "We need to talk privately," she said, leading Ben to her office while Tommy remained happily occupied with the twins. The conversation that followed confirmed Ben's worst fears about the direction things were heading. Juliet's legal team had discovered that the media attention was affecting more than just their personal lives. Several of her business partners were expressing concerns about the distraction of her romantic life, and there were whispers that her company's board was considering whether her personal conduct was affecting her professional effectiveness. "It's ridiculous," Juliet said, pacing behind her desk with controlled fury. "I've never let my personal life interfere with business decisions, and I've built this company into a billion-dollar enterprise through competence, not through managing my public image." "But they're questioning your judgment anyway," Ben said, understanding the impossible position she was in. "Some of them are. There's a board meeting on Monday where they'll likely address the situation formally, and Ben—" She paused, her voice dropping. "Richard's attorney contacted my legal team yesterday. He's arguing that the media attention around my inappropriate relationship with an employee creates an unstable environment for the children. He's requesting a custody review." Ben felt the walls closing in around all of them. Juliet was facing professional and personal challenges that could cost her everything she'd built, while he was dealing with his own custody battle that threatened to tear Tommy away from the only parent he'd ever really known. "There's more," Juliet continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I got a call from Child Protective Services this morning. Someone filed a complaint alleging that I'm exposing Emma and Ethan to inappropriate influences by having a romantic relationship with an employee who lives on the property." "But I don't live here," Ben protested. The complaint apparently referenced the guest house and suggested that I was allowing you to stay overnight with Tommy while maintaining an inappropriate relationship. "It's completely false, but it still requires an investigation." Ben sat down heavily, feeling the weight of how quickly their careful, respectful relationship had been twisted into something sordid and damaging. "Margaret and Robert called this morning," he said. "They're threatening to seek custody of Tommy, claiming that my job here represents poor judgment." They looked at each other across the desk. Two single parents who had found something good and rare, only to watch it being destroyed by people who viewed their relationship as either entertainment or evidence of moral failing. "What do we do?" Ben asked. "I've been thinking about that all week." Juliet pulled out a folder thick with legal documents and media clippings. "My attorney thinks the best strategy is to demonstrate that our relationship is purely professional, that the media has created a narrative that doesn't reflect reality. That would require us to lie," Ben said quietly. "Not lie exactly, just not acknowledge feelings that neither of us has acted on." Ben thought about the truth of that statement. Despite the growing attraction between them, despite the easy, domestic comfort of Thursday's dinner, they hadn't crossed any lines that couldn't be publicly defended. Their relationship existed in the space between professional and personal, undefined but undeniably real. "Would that be enough to protect the children?" he asked. "It might be, if we can convince everyone that the story was manufactured drama. Rather than actual romance, the custody challenges become much weaker. Richard can't argue that our professional relationship creates an unstable environment, and your in-laws would have a harder time claiming that you're prioritizing an inappropriate relationship over Tommy's welfare." Ben found himself thinking about Sarah's letter, the one she'd written during her illness, the one he'd never shown Tommy but carried with him always. She'd written about wanting him to find love again, about hoping he wouldn't let fear prevent him from building a new kind of happiness. But she'd also written about protecting Tommy above all else, about making sure their son always felt secure and loved. "There's something else we need to consider," Juliet said, pulling him from his thoughts. "If we go public with a statement denying any romantic involvement, it becomes much harder to explore those feelings later, when things settle down." Ben understood what she was really asking. By denying their connection publicly, they would be closing a door that might never reopen. The media attention would eventually fade, but the statements they made now would become part of the permanent record, defining their relationship in ways that could prevent it from evolving naturally. "I need to think about what's best for Tommy," Ben said finally. "Of course. And I need to think about what's best for Emma and Ethan." Juliet reached across the desk and touched his hand briefly, a contact that felt both electric and heartbreaking. "But Ben, whatever we decide, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been some of the happiest I've had since the divorce. Having you here, seeing the children respond to you the way they have, it's shown me what a real family could feel like." Ben turned his hand over, briefly clasping her fingers. "It's shown me the same thing." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and loss in equal measure. Through the office window, Ben could see Tommy playing with Emma and Ethan in the garden, their laughter carrying on the afternoon air. It was a picture of the life they might have built together, if the world had been different, if their choices could have been made in private. "We have until Monday," Juliet said, releasing his hand. "The board meeting, the custody reviews, the CPS investigation, everything comes to a head early next week. Whatever we're going to do, we need to decide soon." As Ben drove home that evening with Tommy, chattering about his day with the twins, he found himself facing the kind of decision that would define the rest of their lives. He could protect what they had built, or he could fight for what they might build together, but he was beginning to understand that he might not be able to do both. The letter from Tommy's school was waiting in their mailbox when they arrived. Home. Notice of a mandatory meeting to discuss the ongoing situation affecting Tommy's educational environment. The letter was carefully worded, but Ben could read the subtext. "Solve your problems or find another school for your son." That night, after Tommy was asleep, Ben sat at his kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. One was a resignation letter, formal and professional, citing personal circumstances that made it impossible for him to continue in his position at the Marlowe estate. The other was a statement for the media, clarifying that his relationship with Juliet Marlowe was strictly professional and expressing regret that their employer-employee relationship had been mischaracterized. Both letters would solve the immediate problems. Both would protect the children from further scrutiny. And both would end the best thing that had happened to him since Sarah's death. Ben folded both letters and put them in separate envelopes, then sat looking at them until the morning light began to filter through his kitchen window. By Monday, he would have to choose which letter to send, which future to choose for himself and his son. The decision, he realized, wasn't really about love or security, or even about what was best for the children. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of life he was brave enough to fight for. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Ben had spent the weekend wrestling with his decision, the 2 letters sitting on his kitchen table like opposing futures waiting to be chosen. He'd read Sarah's old letter 3 times, searching for guidance in words written during her final weeks, when she'd still believed he might find love again, despite everything they were facing. The custody hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the downtown courthouse. Ben arrived 30 minutes early, wearing his only suit, a simple black one he'd bought for Sarah's funeral and hadn't worn since. Tommy sat beside him on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, his small legs swinging nervously as he tried to understand why they were here. "Dad, are those people really going to try to make me live with Grandma and Grandpa Collins?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the echoing hallway. "They think it might be better for you," Ben said carefully, "but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we stay together." Margaret and Robert Collins entered the courthouse at precisely 9:45, dressed in expensive clothes that telegraphed their financial advantage. They were accompanied by their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning difficult cases. "Benjamin," Margaret said coolly as they approached. "Tommy." Tommy pressed closer to Ben's side, his usual friendly nature subdued by the formal atmosphere and the knowledge that these people wanted to take him away from his father. "Hello, Margaret." "Robert." Ben stood, placing a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I hope we can resolve this without putting Tommy through any more stress than necessary." "That's entirely up to you," Robert said, his tone suggesting that Ben held all responsibility for the situation they found themselves in. Before Ben could respond, the courtroom doors opened and a bailiff called their case. As they filed into the formal space with its imposing judge's bench and American flag, Ben felt the weight of how much his life had changed since that Tuesday afternoon when he'd simply reacted to children in danger. Judge Patricia Reeves was a woman in her 60s with grey hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested she'd seen every possible family drama played out in her courtroom. She reviewed the case file with methodical care before looking up at the assembled parties. "This is a petition for emergency custody filed by the maternal grandparents, citing concerns about the child's current living situation," she said. "I've reviewed the initial filings, and I have to say, this appears to be based largely on media speculation rather than documented evidence of neglect or endangerment." Ben felt a flicker of hope. Margaret and Robert's attorney had built their case around newspaper clippings and social media posts, not actual evidence of poor parenting. "Your Honor," the Collins attorney began, "our clients are concerned that Mr. Carter's involvement with Juliet Marlowe has created an unstable environment for their grandson. The media attention alone has disrupted the child's education and exposed him to inappropriate scrutiny." "Mr. Carter," Judge Reeves said, turning to Ben, "how do you respond to these concerns?" Ben stood, his heart hammering as he prepared to fight for his son. "Your Honor, my relationship with Ms. Marlowe is professional. I work as a groundskeeper on her estate. The media has created a narrative that doesn't reflect reality, but that's not something I can control. What I can control is providing Tommy with a stable, loving home, which I've done for the past 4 years since his mother's death." "And yet," the Collins attorney interjected, "there are photographs of Mr. Carter dining with Ms. Marlowe and her children, appearing to act as a family unit. Our position is that this blurs appropriate boundaries and exposes Tommy to a situation that's beyond his father's ability to manage." Judge Reeves studied the photographs that had been submitted as evidence, the same invasive images that had started this whole crisis. "Mr. Carter, can you explain the circumstances of this dinner? Ms. Marlowe invited Tommy and me to dinner as a thank you for helping her children during an emergency. It was a family meal, nothing more. Tommy enjoyed playing with the other children, and I thought it was a positive experience for him." The questioning continued for 20 minutes, with the Collins attorney trying to paint Ben as irresponsible, and Ben's public defender doing her best to counter with evidence of his devoted parenting. Tommy sat quietly in the gallery, trying to make himself invisible, while adults debated his future. Just as the judge was preparing to call a recess to review the evidence, the courtroom doors opened. Ben turned to see Juliet entering with purposeful strides, dressed in an elegant business suit that marked her as someone of importance. Behind her came a man Ben didn't recognize, carrying a briefcase that suggested legal expertise of the highest caliber. "Your Honor," Juliet's attorney said. Approaching the bench, "I'm James Morrison, representing Juliet Marlowe. My client has information relevant to this case and requests permission to address the court." Judge Reeves looked surprised, but intrigued. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Morrison. Ms. Marlowe is not a party to this custody proceeding. No, Your Honor, but she is the subject of much of the testimony and evidence presented today. She has a direct interest in correcting misrepresentations that could affect this child's welfare." After a brief conference with the attorneys, Judge Reeves allowed Juliet to be sworn in as a witness. Ben watched in amazement as she took the stand, her presence immediately commanding the courtroom's attention. "Ms. Marlowe," Morrison began, "what is the nature of your relationship with Benjamin Carter?" "Mr. Carter is my employee," Juliet said clearly. "He works as a groundskeeper on my estate. Beyond that professional relationship, he is someone I consider a friend and someone my children trust completely." "Are you romantically involved with Mr. Carter?" Juliet paused, and Ben held his breath. This was the moment that would define everything. The choice between truth and protection, between what was real and what was safe. "No," she said finally. "We are not romantically involved." Ben felt something break inside his chest. It was the right answer, the smart answer, the one that would protect Tommy and Emma and Ethan from further scrutiny. But it was also a denial of something real and precious, a closing of the door on possibilities they'd been too afraid to explore. "Then how do you explain the photographs showing what appears to be a family dinner?" the Collins attorney asked during cross-examination. "I explain it as gratitude," Juliet said firmly. "Mr. Carter saved my children's lives, literally putting himself in danger to protect them. When I learned that his heroic actions had cost him his job, I offered him employment. The dinner was a way to thank him and to allow our children to spend time together. If that's inappropriate, then I would argue that we've lost sight of what real values look like." Her testimony continued for 15 minutes, during which she painted a picture of Ben as a devoted father and dedicated employee, whose only mistake had been caring enough about strangers' children to risk his own safety for them. "One final question, Ms. Marlowe," Morrison said. "In your opinion, would it be in Tommy Carter's best interest to be removed from his father's care?" "Absolutely not," Juliet said without hesitation. "Tommy is one of the most well-adjusted, happy children I've ever encountered. His father has raised him with love, integrity, and values that are increasingly rare in our world. Separating them would be a tragedy that serves no one's interests except those who mistake wealth for wisdom." The directness of her statement sent a murmur through the courtroom. Ben saw Margaret's face flush with anger, but he also saw Judge Reeves nod slightly, as if Juliet had articulated something she'd been thinking herself. After Juliet stepped down, Judge Reeves called a 30-minute recess to review all the testimony and evidence. Ben found himself in the hallway with Juliet, Tommy, and the assembled attorneys, trying to process what had just happened. "You didn't have to do that," Ben said quietly to Juliet. "This could affect your own custody situation." "Yes, I did have to do it," she replied. "Because what they're trying to do to you and Tommy is wrong, and because sometimes you have to fight for what matters, even when it's complicated." Ben looked at her, seeing the strength and determination that had built her company and protected her children through a difficult divorce. She had risked her own reputation and legal standing to defend him, even while maintaining the fiction that their relationship was purely professional. "Thank you," he said, the words insufficient for what he was feeling. "Don't thank me yet," Juliet said. "Let's see what the judge decides." When court reconvened, Judge Reeves delivered her ruling with the measured authority of someone who had considered all angles of a complex situation. "After reviewing all testimony and evidence," she began, "I find no credible evidence that Tommy Carter is being neglected, endangered, or exposed to inappropriate influences by his father. The concerns raised by the petitioners appear to be based on media speculation rather than documented facts." Ben felt his knees weaken with relief, but the judge wasn't finished. "However," Judge Reeves continued, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "I am concerned about the media attention that has surrounded this family. While Mr. Carter cannot be held responsible for tabloid speculation, the court must consider the ongoing impact on the child's well-being. Ben felt his relief evaporate, replaced by a cold dread that crept up his spine. Beside him, Tommy shifted nervously, sensing the change in the courtroom's atmosphere without fully understanding its implications. Therefore, the judge said, I'm granting temporary custody to remain with Mr. Carter, but I'm ordering a 6-month supervision period, during which a court-appointed social worker will monitor the family situation. If the media attention continues to disrupt the child's education or social development, this matter will be revisited. The gavel came down with finality, but Ben felt as though he was standing on shifting ground. He had won, but barely, and, with conditions that felt like a sword hanging over their future, Tommy was staying with him, but their life would now be subject to scrutiny by strangers who would evaluate every decision Ben made as a father. As the courtroom cleared, Margaret Collins approached Ben with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been grudging respect. "This isn't over, Benjamin," she said quietly. "If that woman's presence in your life continues to cause problems for Tommy, we will be back." "I understand," Ben replied, though what he understood was that the battle for his son's future would be ongoing, a constant pressure that would influence every choice he made. Outside the courthouse, Juliet was waiting by her car, her attorney speaking quietly into his phone nearby. She looked up as Ben and Tommy emerged, her face showing the strain of the morning's proceedings. "How are you feeling?" she asked Tommy directly, crouching down to his level with the natural ease she showed with all children. "Confused," Tommy said honestly, "but glad I get to stay with Dad." "That's the most important thing," Juliet said, then stood to face Ben. "We should probably talk about what happens next." The conversation that followed took place in a small cafe several blocks from the courthouse, with Tommy occupied by a coloring book while the adults tried to make sense of their complicated situation. The relief of winning the custody battle was tempered by the reality of what it had cost and what it might continue to cost. "Your testimony saved us today," Ben said, "but I know what it meant for you to say what you said." "It meant I told the truth," Juliet replied. "We're not romantically involved. We haven't acted on whatever feelings might exist between us. But we both know those feelings are real." Juliet nodded, her fingers tracing patterns on the cafe table. "The question is what we do about them now. My attorney thinks the board meeting this afternoon will go better because of my statement in court. If I'm on record saying our relationship is professional, it's harder for them to argue that my personal life is affecting my judgment, and Richard's custody challenge becomes much weaker if there's no romantic relationship to object to." Juliet looked at Tommy, who was carefully coloring within the lines of his picture. "But Ben, the judge was right about the media attention. As long as we're in each other's lives, there will be speculation. There will be photographers trying to catch us in moments that can be misinterpreted." Ben understood what she was really saying. Their friendship, however carefully maintained, would always be viewed through the lens of the story that had been created about them. Every conversation would be potential evidence of something more than professional courtesy. Every shared meal would be photographed and analyzed for romantic subtext. "So what are you suggesting?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew. "I think—" Juliet paused, her voice catching slightly. "I think maybe it would be better if you found another position, something that doesn't involve me or my children, something that lets you build a life for Tommy without the complications my presence brings." The words hit Ben like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them. It was the logical solution, the smart choice that would protect everyone involved. But it also meant losing the job he'd grown to love, the children who had become important to him, and the woman who had shown him that his heart was still capable of hoping for more than just survival. "I've been thinking the same thing," Ben admitted. "I drafted a resignation letter over the weekend, but you didn't send it." "No, because walking away feels like letting them win. the people who think they can destroy something good just because it doesn't fit their idea of how the world should work. Juliet reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture that would have been photographed and dissected if they'd been anywhere more public than this small neighborhood cafe. Ben, what we found together, the friendship, the way our children connected, the possibility of something more, that's real. But the cost of pursuing it might be too high for everyone involved, including Emma and Ethan. Especially Emma and Ethan. They've already been through one custody battle with their father. I can't put them through another one, especially not when the challenge is based on my relationship with you. Ben looked at Tommy, who had finished his coloring and was now building an elaborate structure out of sugar packets. His face serene with the kind of focused concentration that reminded Ben so much of Sarah. His son had already endured the loss of his mother, the financial struggles that followed, and now the trauma of nearly being separated from his only remaining parent. What if we tried something different? Ben said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. What if we gave them exactly what they claimed to want? Complete professional distance. I continue working at the estate, but we establish clear boundaries. No family dinners, no personal conversations, no interactions beyond what's absolutely necessary for the job. That would be, Juliet paused, considering the implications. Incredibly difficult, but it might work. If we can demonstrate that we're capable of maintaining professional boundaries, the speculation dies down. The board sees that you can separate personal and professional decisions. The custody challenges lose their foundation. And what about us? What about what we feel for each other? Ben was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy's careful engineering with the sugar packets. Maybe what we feel for each other isn't as important as what we both feel for our children. It was a painful truth, but as Ben spoke the words, he realized they carried a weight of conviction that surprised him. He cared for Juliet deeply, more deeply than he'd cared for anyone since Sarah. But Tommy would always come first, just as Emma and Ethan would always come first for her. So we pretend, Juliet said softly. We act like we're nothing more than employer and employee, even when we're alone, for 6 months. Until the court supervision ends and things settle down. If we can prove that we're capable of appropriate boundaries, maybe then we can see if there's anything left to explore. They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding the magnitude of what they were agreeing to attempt. It would mean suppressing feelings that had grown naturally, denying the connection that had developed between them, and maintaining a fiction that would be emotionally exhausting for both of them. But it would also mean protecting their children from further upheaval, preserving the stability that both Tommy and the twins needed, and possibly, eventually, creating a foundation for something genuine to develop when the external pressures had subsided. I have one condition, Ben said finally. What's that? Tommy gets to continue playing with Emma and Ethan. Whatever boundaries we establish between us, the children shouldn't suffer for adult complications they don't understand. Juliet smiled, for the first time since they'd left the courthouse. That's not a condition, that's a requirement. Those children have been good for each other. Emma and Ethan ask about Tommy every day. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Ben felt the weight of the decision they'd made, settling around him like a coat he wasn't sure would fit. They were choosing the hardest possible path, staying close enough to maintain their professional relationship while denying the personal connection that made that proximity both meaningful and painful. But they were also choosing their children's welfare over their own desires, which felt like the kind of sacrifice that parents were supposed to make, even when it hurt more than they'd expected. Ben, Juliet said, as they reached the parking lot, for what it's worth, I think we're doing the right thing. I hope so, Ben replied, though he wasn't sure whether he was hoping they were right about the sacrifice being necessary or hoping they would eventually be wrong about it being permanent. The wedding rings they might have exchanged someday remained unworn, symbolic of a commitment they were choosing not to make, in favor of commitments they'd already made to the children who depended on them for everything. 6 months later, Ben stood in the same courthouse hallway where his life had nearly been torn apart, but this time he carried a manila folder containing the social worker's final report rather than the desperate hope of a father fighting to keep his son. The words exemplary parenting and stable home environment were highlighted in yellow throughout the document, validation that the sacrifices he and Juliet had made had accomplished their intended purpose. Tommy sat beside him on the familiar wooden bench, no longer the frightened 8-year-old who had worried about being taken away from his father. The past 6 months had been difficult in unexpected ways, not because of any lingering media attention which had died down as Juliet had predicted, but because of the careful emotional distance Ben had been forced to maintain from the woman, who still made his heart skip when he saw her each morning. "Dad, will things go back to normal now?" Tommy asked, swinging his legs in the gesture that had become his trademark during moments of uncertainty. "I think they'll go back to a different kind of normal," Ben said carefully, "but hopefully a good kind." The truth was more complicated than anything Ben could explain to his son. Over the past 6 months, he and Juliet had successfully demonstrated that they could maintain appropriate professional boundaries. Their interactions had been polite, efficient, and completely focused on Ben's responsibilities as groundskeeper and occasional childcare assistant when Elena was unavailable. But beneath that professional veneer, something deeper had been growing. The forced distance had clarified feelings that might have remained confused in the natural progression of a relationship. Ben had discovered that his attraction to Juliet wasn't based on proximity or gratitude or the simple loneliness of single parenthood. It was based on admiration for her strength, appreciation for her intelligence, and recognition of shared values that transcended their different backgrounds. The question now was whether she had come to similar realizations during their months of careful separation. Judge Reeves called them into her chambers for the final hearing, a much less formal proceeding than the custody battle that had brought them here originally. The social worker's report was comprehensive and unambiguously positive. Tommy was thriving academically and socially, Ben had demonstrated consistent parenting skills, and the family situation showed every sign of long-term stability. "Mr. Carter," Judge Reeves said, "I'm pleased to close this supervision case with a finding that your son is in an excellent home environment. The court's concerns about media disruption have proved unfounded, and I commend you for handling a difficult situation with such maturity." "Thank you, Your Honor. Tommy and I are grateful for the court's oversight, and we're looking forward to moving on with our lives." As they left the courthouse, Ben felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. For 6 months, every decision he'd made as a father had been subject to review and evaluation. Every interaction with Juliet had been carefully measured against the possibility that someone might misinterpret their relationship and use it as ammunition against him. Now, finally, he was free to be just a father again, and free to explore feelings he'd been forced to suppress for the sake of protecting his son. The drive to the Marlowe estate felt different today. Ben had called ahead to let Juliet know about the hearing's outcome, but they hadn't discussed what it might mean for their relationship beyond the immediate relief of knowing that external pressures had been resolved. Tommy chattered excitedly in the passenger seat about his plans to show Emma and Ethan the new magic tricks he'd learned, blissfully unaware that his father was nervous about a conversation that could change everything. They found Juliet in the garden, supervising while Emma and Ethan helped Elena plant bulbs that would bloom in the spring. She looked up as Ben and Tommy approached, her smile genuine but cautious in the way that had become habitual during their months of careful distance. "How did it go?" she asked, directing the question to both of them. "Perfect," Tommy announced before Ben could respond. "The judge said Dad is an exemplary parent and that our family is stable. I don't know what those words mean exactly, but they sound good." "They are good," Juliet said, her eyes meeting Ben's over Tommy's head. "Very good." Emma and Ethan immediately claimed Tommy for their gardening project, and within minutes all three children were absorbed in the serious business of ensuring that each bulb was planted at precisely the right depth and spacing. Elena supervised with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to let children make their own mistakes while preventing actual disasters. "Can we talk?" Ben asked quietly. They walked toward the maintenance shed, following a path they'd traveled countless times during the past 6 months, but today it felt like they were walking toward something new rather than simply fulfilling. "Routine obligations. I brought you something," Ben said when they were out of earshot of the children. He pulled a small, wrapped package from his jacket pocket, feeling suddenly uncertain about the gesture he'd planned. Juliet unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple picture frame containing a photograph that Ben had taken the previous week without her knowledge. It showed Emma, Ethan, and Tommy working together to build an elaborate fort out of fallen branches, their faces serious with concentration as they engineered their creation. In the background, barely visible, Juliet could be seen watching, them with the kind of smile that spoke of deep contentment. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "When did you take this?" "Last Tuesday, when you thought I was just trimming the oak trees. I've been watching all of you for months, seeing how natural you are together, how much the children care about each other." Ben paused, gathering his courage for what he needed to say next. "And I've been thinking about what we talked about 6 months ago, about whether there might be something worth exploring when the external pressures settled down." Juliet set the photograph down carefully on the workbench, next to the tools Ben used every day to maintain the beauty of her family's home. "I've been thinking about that too. And what have you concluded? That I've spent 6 months working beside someone I care about deeply while pretending that caring was inappropriate. That I've watched my children develop a relationship with a man who treats them with more genuine affection than their own father ever did. And that I've never felt safer or happier than I do when you're here." Ben stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the subtle perfume she wore that had become associated in his mind with home and possibility. "Juliet, I know we come from different worlds. I know there will always be people who question whether someone like me belongs in your life. But I also know that what I feel for you isn't going away, and I don't want to spend another 6 months pretending it doesn't exist." "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you'd like to try something we've never done before. A real relationship. Not employer and employee, not friends tiptoeing around attraction, but two people who care about each other, seeing if they can build something together." Juliet was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Ben's face to the photograph of their children, to the garden, where those children were still absorbed in their play. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally. "The board meeting 6 months ago, the one I was so worried about. They voted to promote me to CEO. The speculation about my personal life actually convinced them that I was human rather than just a business machine, that I understood the importance of family and relationships." Ben smiled, feeling proud of her. Success, even as he wondered what it might mean for them. "Congratulations, you deserve it. The point is, I'm in a stronger position now than I was 6 months ago. Professionally, personally, financially, I don't need to worry about other people's opinions the way I used to. And what does that mean for us?" Instead of answering with words, Juliet stepped closer and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative. At first, then deeper as 6 months of suppressed feelings found their expression. When they separated, Ben felt like he was breathing clearly for the first time in half a year. "It means," Juliet said, "that I'd like to find out what it feels like to be a family with you, a real family, not just people who care about each other but don't act on it." In the distance they could hear Tommy's laughter mixing with Emma and Ethan's voices as they played in the garden they'd helped create. The sound was pure joy, the music of children who felt safe and loved and free to be exactly who they were. Ben pulled Juliet closer, marveling at how right it felt to hold her without measuring the gesture against potential consequences or external judgments. For the first time since that Tuesday afternoon, when he'd abandoned his tools to save two children he didn't know, Ben felt like his life was moving in a direction he'd chosen, rather than one that had been chosen for him. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now that he was finally free to speak them. "I love you too," she replied, "and I love what we could build together, all of us." 6 months later, Ben would carry a different kind of photograph, a new family portrait taken on their wedding day, showing all 5 of them standing together in the garden where their story had really begun. But for now, it was enough to hold the woman he loved while their children played nearby, to know that sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from the willingness to act when action was needed, to love when love was possible, and to fight for happiness even when the odds seemed impossible. The weight of cedar shingles, the same ones Ben had noticed that first morning, had taught him that some things were worth the effort it took to maintain them. Love, he was learning, was like that too, requiring daily attention, careful nurturing, and the faith that what you were building would last long enough to matter. In the garden where Emma, Ethan, and Tommy continued their elaborate play, spring. Bulbs waited beneath the soil for the right time to bloom. Like the best kinds of love, they would emerge when conditions were right, bringing beauty that was worth the patience it took to create.